This is my true story. My son once promised me I'd never sleep in discomfort again. I believed him. I believed that love was thicker than pride, and that family could not betray blood. But one day, I walked into my own room and found my bed gone. The same bed I slept in for years, handed over to his father-in-law like a spare chair. That moment tore something deep inside me, and healed something else. Before I tell you how I answered that insult, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe so more people hear my story. That bed was more than a frame and mattress. It was a piece of my life. I had bought it 40 years ago, when my back first began to ache from decades of construction work. Every nail, every plank of wood, every dollar I earned had come from sweat, dust, and stubborn pride. I didn't buy it for luxury. I bought it because it was the one place my body could rest after years of lifting, bending, and carrying the weight of family and survival. That bed had seen sickness, sleepless nights, and the quiet peace of early mornings. It held memories, not just bones. I remember the night my son was born. I came home from the hospital, sat on that bed, and wept with gratitude. I had promised myself then that I would build him a life better than mine. Every success he ever had came from the labor that started and ended on that same bed. When he was a little boy, he would crawl beside me and ask for bedtime stories. He used to say the smell of the sheets reminded him of safety, and I would smile thinking, this boy will grow up and never know struggle like I did. How foolish I was. Time changes people, and comfort can rot the roots of gratitude. As he grew older, his words grew sharper, his tone colder. The man who once clung to my arm as a child now spoke to me like I was a burden that refused to die. But even through that, I never imagined he would touch that bed. When I grew too old to walk stairs easily, I slept in the same ground floor room where that bed stood. It became my small world. The window beside it showed the sunrise every morning, and the scent of the garden drifted in through the curtains. That room was peace to me. Until one afternoon, when I returned home after my doctor's appointment, I saw men carrying it out through the door. My son stood there, his sleeves rolled up, giving orders like a boss in his own warehouse. I asked, "What are you doing?" He didn't even look ashamed. He just said, "Father, we're giving this to my father-in-law. He needs it more." Those words didn't hit me at once. They floated around me like smoke before burning through my chest. I asked, "And where will I sleep?" He waved his hand and pointed toward a small cot, like the ones we used to keep for servants during festival nights. His wife stood in the hallway, arms crossed, smirking as if I had asked for charity. In that moment, every lesson I had taught him, about respect, about kindness, about honor, seemed to have died inside his heart. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I just looked at the empty spot where the bed had stood, the clean rectangle on the floor that still held the outline of my peace. I remembered the years I carried him to school when he had fever. I remembered fixing his roof when he bought his first house. I remembered the money I loaned him to start his business. And now, the man I raised had taken the bed where I once prayed for his success and given it away to another man, as if my comfort had no meaning. That bed was not furniture. It was the last piece of my dignity. That night, I lay on that small cot, its metal joints squeaking every time I moved. The ceiling above me looked farther than it ever had. I could not sleep. Every sound, the ticking clock, the rustling leaves, the faint laughter from my son's room, stabbed at my ears. It wasn't about losing a bed. It was about losing respect. It was the realization that I no longer belonged in the house I built. That cot became a reminder that I was now an unwanted guest. I stayed awake till morning, my back aching, eyes fixed on the blank wall. And in that silence, I promised myself that I would never be humiliated again, not under my own roof, not by my own blood. That promise was the seed of what came next. The moment that broke me didn't come with shouting or anger. It came wrapped in laughter. A week later, his wife's family came over for dinner. The table was crowded. Fancy plates, silver spoons, glasses taller than my old habits. I sat at the end, silent, half listening to their conversations about business, travel, and comfort. Then his father-in-law, a man who never worked a day in dust or rain, said with a proud grin, "That bed you gave us, son, sleeps like heaven." Everyone laughed. My son smiled, nodded, and raised his glass. "It's the best one in the house," he said. "My house, my bed, my years." I watched them celebrate a theft dressed as generosity. My fork trembled in my hand, but I kept my face still. Not one word escaped my lips. He looked at me once, across the table, maybe to see if I'd react. But I didn't. I knew that was what he wanted. To see the old man's pride crack, to prove that I had no power left. So I sat still, swallowing my silence like poison. Around me, laughter echoed against the walls I built brick by brick. The same walls that once held our family's joy now carried the noise of mockery. His wife leaned close to her father and said, "See, Dad? I told you my husband takes care of people better than anyone." I wanted to laugh then, not from humor, but disbelief. He couldn't even take care of the man who gave him life. It was a small act in their eyes. Just a bed, just a gift. But it was the loudest insult I had ever received. There are words that bruise and actions that bleed you quietly from the inside. This one did both. I didn't lose my temper, but I lost something deeper. That invisible bond between father and son that no apology can rebuild once it's snapped. That dinner table turned into a courtroom in my mind. Every sound was a witness to my humiliation. The clinking of glasses, the scrape of knives, the echo of laughter that grew louder than the truth. When the meal ended, I rose slowly. No one noticed. I walked to my old room, the one now stripped bare, and stood in the empty space where the bed used to be. The floor still had marks, the faint dents from its legs, a ghostly outline of where peace once rested. I looked at those marks and saw my entire life drawn in dust. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I realized that tears would only feed their satisfaction. They had already taken what was mine. I wouldn't give them my dignity too. That night, as they laughed and played music in the living room, I stood near the window. The moonlight fell across the cot where I was supposed to sleep, thin and cold like the truth. I remembered the nights I stayed awake for him. The times I walked miles to bring medicine when he was sick. The nights I waited outside his exams to take him home. The mornings I skipped meals so he could have more. All those memories suddenly felt like they belonged to a stranger. Gratitude was gone, replaced by pride and greed. I realized then that the insult wasn't just about a bed. It was about how far he had drifted from the values I once taught him. He had learned how to earn money, but forgotten how to value people. He had learned to buy things, but not to cherish what cannot be replaced. I knew from that moment that love, when given to the ungrateful, becomes a weapon used against you. That dinner, that laughter, that cruel little thank you to his father-in-law, that was my awakening. So I decided to do nothing in haste. I would not confront him. I would not curse him. I would let the silence grow between us like winter. Because sometimes silence is not surrender. It's preparation. I let him think he had won. I let him believe I was weak. But in my heart, I began building something stronger than revenge. A plan. One that would not shout or break, but cut through everything he thought he owned. I have never been the kind of man to speak of what I have. Life taught me early that the loudest men often have the least to show. So I learned to save quietly, to prepare for storms others never see coming. Long before my hair turned white, I began setting aside small amounts, not for luxury, but for security. Each paycheck, each leftover dollar from groceries, every bit of extra from a side job. It all went into an account only I knew about. No one ever asked, and I never told. I called it my quiet fund, because it grew in silence while the world thought I was empty-handed. My son used to mock me for being too old-fashioned, saying I didn't understand the new ways of money. He didn't know that I understood money far better than he ever would. I understood what it meant to need it. Over the years, that account became my invisible armor. It wasn't just savings. It was a reminder that independence was worth more than respect that had to be begged for. I watched my son build his business with loans I helped him secure. I watched him rise, boast, and drown himself in success. He thought his wealth made him untouchable. He believed he was the only one in control. But what he didn't know was that the foundation of his comfort still rested on me, on the man he now dismissed as old and useless. After the night of the dinner, I sat at my small desk, opened my old ledger book, and looked at the numbers. Years of discipline, years of saving, years of pretending to be poorer than I was. All of it right there, written in neat black ink. It wasn't billions or fame, but it was enough. Enough to change a life. Enough to destroy another. That night I realized that silence had given me power. While he flaunted cars, watches, and dinner parties, I had built something he could neither see nor control. He laughed at my frugal habits, never realizing that those habits had kept me free. I remember his words from a few months before that dinner. "Dad, why do you bother keeping those old papers and notebooks? You don't have anything left to save." He was wrong. I had more than savings. I had a plan. My hidden account was my last fortress, one that could protect dignity or strike with precision. I had built it for emergencies, but betrayal felt like the truest emergency I had ever known. I went to the bank quietly the next day. The manager, a man I had known for decades, looked at me with polite surprise when I walked in with my old hat and coat. He still remembered how I used to deposit small amounts every month, without fail. "You've been consistent all your life, sir," he said with a smile. I nodded, replying softly, "That's how peace is built." Quietly. When he printed the balance, he looked at me differently. It wasn't a fortune to the world, but to a man like me, it was power. As I walked home, the wind bit my face, but I felt no cold. I felt something else. Purpose. I had watched my son's arrogance for too long, excused it as youth, forgiven it as pride. But giving away my bed, my comfort, my dignity, that was the final straw. The insult lit something deep inside me, something that didn't crave violence but justice. I knew I could never make him understand pain through words. He only understood loss. So I sat that night in the dark, staring at the small box that held my bank documents. The moonlight fell across the papers like a silent blessing. He thought he had stripped me of everything, but he had no idea what I still held in my hands. He thought I was powerless, yet I was the one holding the strings. That realization steadied my heart. Revenge wasn't about rage, it was about timing, and my time had just begun. There was one name my family never knew, a name I carried quietly like a locked drawer inside my heart. He wasn't born from my blood, but from my conscience. Years ago, before my wife died, I met a young boy working outside a train station. Barefoot, dirty, and thin as a shadow, he was selling flowers to strangers for coins. His mother had died, his father had disappeared, and he was living under a broken tin roof behind the tracks. I used to pass that way every morning on my way to work. One day, he offered me a single wilted flower and said, "Sir, please take it. You look tired." I don't know why that line stuck with me. Maybe because no one had said those words to me in years. I gave him some food, some coins, and walked away. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about him, about how a boy with nothing still had kindness left in him. The next day, I went back. That small act became a ritual. Each evening, I would bring him food or a warm blanket, sometimes just sit and talk with him. He told me his name was Arav. He was 8 then. Over the years, I helped him quietly, paid for his schooling, bought his books, and when he grew older, found him small jobs. He never asked who I was or why I helped. He only said once, "If I ever become someone, I'll make you proud." He didn't know how much he already had. He called me uncle, but in my heart, I began to think of him as my secret son. My real family never knew about him. I never told my wife, never told my son. I wanted to protect that small bond from the world's gossip and greed. Arav was pure. He didn't take advantage, didn't demand, didn't lie. Even after he finished school, he kept visiting me. Sometimes he'd help repair the fence, or bring fruits from the market, or just sit on the porch with me and talk about life. When I got older, he'd come by quietly, making sure I had my medicine, checking if I'd eaten. No one else in my life did that anymore. Not even my own son. So when my son took my bed, the same one I once shared stories about honor and family from. I thought about Arav. I thought about how life gives you two kinds of children, one from your blood and one from your soul. The first can betray you, the second restores your faith. And that night, as I looked over my secret bank papers, something inside me whispered his name. Arav. The boy who had nothing, who never took advantage, who never humiliated me. He had no house, no savings, no inheritance, just heart. He was working as a mechanic in a small garage, earning little, saving every coin for his dream to open a repair shop of his own. He reminded me of myself at his age, humble, proud, and tired of being poor but never bitter. I realized then that maybe I had been saving not for myself, but for him. Maybe all those years of thrift and secrecy had been leading to this one act. He deserved something more, a chance, a beginning, a roof, a life with dignity. And maybe giving it to him would finally make sense of all the pain I carried. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with his name written on a small paper beside my bank documents. I knew what I had to do. The choice was heavy, but it was clear. I would take everything my ungrateful son believed was his, the $2.1 million worth of savings, property, and assets, and give it to the boy who had earned it through kindness alone. I felt peace for the first time in years, not because I was taking revenge, but because I was setting the scales right. Blood had failed me, but conscience had not. Arav never asked for anything, which is exactly why he deserved everything. I didn't wake up the next morning with rage. I woke up with clarity. Real revenge doesn't scream, it plans in silence. As the sun filtered through the curtains, I sat at my small wooden desk with my old fountain pen, the one I used to sign my first house papers. My son thought I was too old to handle money, too weak to think for myself. He had no idea that the same man he humiliated could still write his own ending, clean, legal, and irreversible. I didn't call anyone. I didn't make a scene. I simply began organizing every document I had, bank passbooks, property deeds, bonds, and savings certificates. Decades of patience were now the instruments of one final decision. First, I called my lawyer. He had been with me for years, a quiet man who never asked too many questions. When I told him I wanted to transfer everything I owned, he hesitated. "Are you sure, sir?" "You'll be left with nothing," I smiled. "I already have nothing. Now I'm just making it official." He nodded slowly, understanding something deeper than words. We spent hours going through the paperwork. I didn't mention my son's name once. I didn't have to. The betrayal was already signed in invisible ink between every page. By the time the sun dipped, the arrangements were in place. All I had to do was sign. I went home that evening and sat in the quiet. My son was out, probably hosting another dinner, showing off the life I built for him. His wife was in the living room, scrolling through her phone. I passed her by without a word. When I reached my small cot, I stared at the space where my old bed used to be. I whispered to myself, "Tomorrow, this space will belong to no one." That night, I didn't feel pain. I felt power. For years I had begged for respect, hoping love would bring it back. But love without respect is just slavery. Now I would end it. The next day, I met Arav. I told him to meet me at a cafe far from the neighborhood. When he arrived, he looked the same as always. Grease on his hands, tired eyes, but that same honest smile. He asked, "Uncle, are you all right?" I looked at him and saw the son I wished I had. I said, "I'm fine, my boy. I just wanted to see you." We talked for a while about his work, his dreams, his small garage. Then I handed him a sealed envelope. He frowned, confused. "What's this?" I said. "A promise I made long ago. Don't open it now. Go home. Read it tomorrow." He didn't argue. He never did. He thanked me, hugged me tightly, something my real son hadn't done in years, and left. I walked home slower than usual that day. Every step felt lighter, as if I was leaving behind the weight of decades. I knew what I had done couldn't be undone, and I didn't want it to be. The papers were filed, the accounts had been updated. My hidden fund was no longer mine. It was Arav's, the property title too. My lawyer said the transfer would take effect in a few days. My son would wake up to a world where his name was removed from everything he thought he owned. When I returned home that evening, my son was sitting in the living room, laughing with his father-in-law, the man who now slept in my bed. He looked up and said, "Father, you look tired. You should rest." I smiled faintly and replied, "Yes, I think I will." For the last time, he didn't understand the meaning of that sentence, but someday he would. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I didn't even look back at him again. That night, I felt an old man's peace, the kind that comes only when everything that needs to be done has been done. Revenge was not noise. Revenge was paperwork, and mine was signed, sealed, and ready to break him in silence. 3 days later, the silence I had built began to move. The transfer went through. No headlines, no announcement, no trace that could be tracked by my son's greedy eyes. Just a simple transaction. $2.1 million shifted from one account to another. The same hands that once built a home were now writing its final chapter. I had instructed my lawyer to ensure the process left no open ends. The bank confirmed it all quietly. Every last cent, every investment, every property under my name, gone from me, safe with Arav. The boy who once sold flowers now had a future stronger than any inheritance my blood ever deserved. I didn't tell Arav immediately. I wanted him to discover it in his own time, without pressure, without guilt. I knew him. He would never ask why. He would only whisper, "Thank you," and then work twice as hard to earn it. That was the difference between him and my real son. One felt entitled to everything, the other felt grateful for anything. The same day the transfer cleared, I walked out into the garden, the one I had planted when my son was a boy. The wind smelled different. For the first time in years, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt free. At home, my son was arguing with his wife about some party expense. They didn't notice me sitting in the corner, sipping tea. They never did. He spoke loudly about the new car he wanted, the new watch he planned to buy, the investment property he was about to purchase. I watched him boast about money that was no longer his. Every word was a ghost echoing in an empty vault. The power he believed he had was already gone. He just didn't know it yet. There was something poetic about that, watching arrogance speak while its foundation quietly vanished beneath it. By evening, my lawyer sent me one final message. All done. The account is now under Arav's full name, documents sealed and verified. I looked at the message for a long time. Then I deleted it. There was no need for proof anymore. I didn't need the world to know what I'd done. This wasn't revenge for attention. This was justice for peace. That night, I packed my small bag, just some clothes, my medicine, and a photograph of my wife. I walked one last round through the house. Every corner carried memories, but not warmth. My son and his wife were asleep upstairs. I stood by the empty space where my bed once stood, the one he gave away without shame. I whispered softly, "You took my rest from me, so I've taken your comfort from you." My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. I left the keys on the table, next to a folded letter addressed to him, not explaining, not apologizing. Just a single line. A father's silence is not weakness. It is judgment. Then I walked out into the cool night. I didn't take the car. I didn't need it. I took the path down the road, where no one knew my name, and no one expected me to stay. The stars looked brighter than they had in years. I thought of Arav, somewhere across town, probably closing up his workshop, still working late. Soon he would receive the documents. Soon his world would change forever, and mine would finally be at peace. Back at the house, my son would wake up the next morning thinking everything was the same, until the phone calls began. The bank's tone would change. The lawyer's line would go silent. The property title would read another name, and for the first time in his life, he'd feel what I felt that night he gave away my bed: disbelief, helplessness, and the quiet taste of humiliation. By the time he understood it all, I'd be far away, sitting somewhere small and quiet, watching the sunrise with no burden on my chest. I didn't need the money. I didn't need revenge to be seen. All I needed was balance, and I had restored it. The morning my son woke to his ruin was, by all measures, an ordinary day. The sun rose the same way. The birds still sang. But inside that grand house, the one I built, brick by brick, before he called it his, something shifted. I was already gone by then, long before the first light touched the windows. My room stood empty, the cot neatly folded, the letter on the table untouched. I imagine he came downstairs still half asleep, searching for coffee, still carrying that careless confidence of a man who believes the world revolves around him. He didn't yet know that by breakfast his empire would be dust. It started with a phone call. The bank. Routine, he thought. But the tone on the other side wasn't routine at all. They informed him that his name was no longer attached to several joint accounts, that new ownership had been verified and confirmed. At first he laughed, assuming it was a clerical error. He demanded to speak to the manager, threatened legal action, shouted his usual way, the way of a man who's never faced real consequence. But the more he shouted, the quieter the world became. The manager, the staff, the lawyers, all said the same thing. The transfers were final. The authority behind them was legitimate. His voice broke somewhere in the middle of that conversation, and for the first time, panic found him. He hung up and called his lawyer, the same lawyer who used to represent me. But of course, that lawyer couldn't help him, because that lawyer had already executed my wishes. He must have realized it then, like a man discovering his shadow too late. He stormed through the house, calling my name, searching every corner as though I'd be hiding behind a curtain, waiting to undo everything. But I was gone. He found the letter instead, that single folded page with my handwriting. I can imagine his eyes scanning the line again and again. A father's silence is not weakness. It is judgment. His wife must have come down when she heard the noise. She would have asked, "What's wrong?" He would have shouted, "He took everything." And she would have said, "What do you mean everything?" And then the reality would have fallen like winter through the open door. The house, the accounts, the land, the investments, all of it gone. The cars outside still shined, but they were no longer his. Even the furniture inside was listed under assets he no longer owned. He must have walked into that empty space where my bed used to stand and finally understood what he had done. He had taken from me the only comfort I had left, and now comfort had abandoned him too. By noon, the real estate agents arrived, not by my doing, but by procedure. They were sent to assess what remained of his holdings. His face, once so full of arrogance, now carried disbelief. Neighbors watched from their windows, whispering as he argued with men carrying clipboards. The same people who once envied his success now saw him standing barefoot on the cold marble of a house he no longer owned. Even his father-in-law, the man who slept in my bed, avoided him. Pride has a strange way of collapsing. It doesn't shatter loudly, it sinks quietly, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. As he begged the lawyers and banks for explanations, I was miles away, sitting on a park bench with my tea. I didn't need to see his face to know what it looked like. I had seen it before, in the mirror, the night he humiliated me. The look of disbelief, the collapse of ego, the moment a man realizes he has no one left to blame but himself. The same silence he gave me now belonged to him. That day, as his name vanished from every record, my heart grew still. Not joyful, but calm. Because justice, when it arrives slowly, feels less like revenge and more like truth taking its rightful place. My son had finally learned the cost of pride, and I had finally reclaimed my peace. Word travels faster than shame can hide. Within days, the whispers began. The same neighbors who once smiled at my son from their porches now whispered behind closed curtains. "Did you hear? He lost everything. The old man took it all. He gave away his father's bed, now he sleeps on the floor." It spread like wildfire, from street corners to business circles. Those who used to praise his success now watched him stumble in public, his pride stripped to its bones. The restaurants that once reserved his table suddenly had no space. The friends who toasted his wealth suddenly had reasons not to call. Even his wife's family, the ones who laughed the night he humiliated me, quietly distanced themselves. Their calls stopped. Their invitations disappeared. The father-in-law who had bragged about that fine bed now pretended he barely knew him. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard enough through old acquaintances. One of my friends from the neighborhood told me how my son had gone back to the bank, shouting, demanding explanations. The guards escorted him out. Another said he saw my son's car repossessed in the middle of the street, the neighbors watching as men in uniforms drove it away. He had once driven through that same street honking his horn like a king returning from victory. Now, he walked with his head down, pretending not to see the people who pitied him. Pride is a strange beast. It starves to death the moment admiration stops feeding it. His business began to crumble too. Without assets to secure loans, his partners withdrew. His clients hesitated. Even the employees who once feared him began to leave, one by one. He tried to borrow money, but no one trusted him anymore. They had all heard the same thing. He lost everything. The old man cut him off. Every door that once opened with his name now stayed closed. The empire he bragged about wasn't built on skill or wisdom. It was built on my foundation. And when that foundation moved, everything collapsed. At home, things grew darker. His wife, who once treated me like a burden, started shouting at him. "How could you let this happen? You said everything was under control. My father told me you were responsible." The irony made me smile when I heard it. The same man who accepted my bed now blamed him for losing his own. Life has a way of returning lessons in perfect symmetry. I didn't need to lift a finger. The world did the work for me. Eventually, the fights grew louder. His wife left, took her clothes, her jewelry, and her father's pride with her. She told everyone she couldn't live with a man who had nothing left. And just like that, the house that was once full of noise and arrogance turned silent. He sold whatever he could, his watches, his furniture, even the paintings on the wall. But no amount of money could fix the rot that had already eaten through his reputation. One afternoon, one of his old friends, a decent man, found him sitting outside a cafe, alone, staring at the ground. He told me later, he looked like a man who'd forgotten what standing up felt like. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow stare. That's how downfall works. It doesn't announce itself. It seeps in until even your reflection feels like a stranger. Meanwhile, Arav, the boy I had helped, had opened his small repair shop. He hung a simple wooden signboard that read Arav Auto Works. When I visited him, the place was filled with the sound of tools, laughter, and honest work. He didn't know yet about the full extent of what I'd given him, and I didn't tell him. It wasn't about glory. It was about grace. Watching him build from gratitude while my son fell from greed felt like balance restored by unseen hands. My son's name no longer carried weight, and his silence grew thicker with every passing day. He had lived loudly when life was easy. Now he lived quietly because there was nothing left to say. The world had finally given him back the same coldness he once gave me. People often think revenge feels sweet, but it doesn't. Not when it's this personal. The night I heard my son had lost everything, I didn't smile. I sat alone in a small rented room miles away from the house that used to be mine, staring at the ceiling as rain tapped the window. I thought about him, not the man he became, but the boy he used to be. The boy who ran barefoot through the garden. The boy who climbed into my lap after a nightmare. The boy who once said, "When I grow up, I'll take care of you." Those memories came uninvited, cutting sharper than any knife. I had destroyed his empire, yes, but in doing so, I had buried that little boy too. And that was the part that hurt. I made tea and sat by the window until dawn. The world outside was quiet. Farmers walking to the fields, shopkeepers opening shutters. Life going on, unaware that one man had just undone decades of history in his family. I wasn't proud. I wasn't regretful either. I just was. There's a kind of emptiness that follows justice. It isn't sadness, it's silence. The kind that makes you realize how costly peace can be. For days, I thought about going back. Just once. To see him. To see if he'd changed. But then I'd remind myself that this wasn't about seeing him suffer. It was about making sure he finally understood what pain he had caused. If I went back, I'd ruin it. I'd let him believe I could forgive. And forgiveness, I had learned, was not always kindness. Sometimes it's a curse, letting a man forget the lesson he needs to remember forever. So I stayed away. I heard from others that he tried to rebuild, tried to start a smaller business, tried to call me once or twice, but my number had changed. I imagined him pacing in his empty house, realizing that no one owed him respect anymore, not the banks, not his friends, not me. That's when I realized something strange. I didn't hate him anymore. Hatred requires energy, and I didn't have any left to give. What I felt was colder, quieter, detachment. The kind of feeling that says, "You are no longer part of me." Arav visited often. He'd bring groceries, fix the window, or just sit with me as I read the paper. He didn't know the full story. He didn't know that the man who'd helped him was also the man who had disowned his own blood. But every time he smiled, every time he spoke with gratitude, I felt the balance of the world tilt back to where it belonged. Through him, I found something close to healing. He reminded me that goodness still exists, that kindness is not extinct, only misplaced. Still, at night, I would lie awake and wonder if I had gone too far. Maybe I could have given him one more chance. Maybe the bed wasn't worth this storm. But then I'd remember that night, him pointing at my bed like it was scrap, telling me his father-in-law needed it more. The way his wife smiled, the way the room laughed, the way I sat in silence. That was when I stopped being his father in his eyes. So how could I continue pretending he was my son in mine? Dignity, I learned, has a price. Sometimes it costs you family, sometimes it costs you peace. But without it, you are just breathing, not living. I had spent a lifetime giving, forgiving, hoping, and in the end, the only way to protect what little respect I had left was to take everything back. It wasn't joy that kept me alive after that. It was calm, a calm so deep it felt like starting over. I walk every morning now through the same streets where I once worked. No one recognizes me, and I prefer it that way. People think revenge is about making the other person fall. But for me, it was about standing again. My son may never recover what he lost, but I found what he took, my self-respect. That to me is worth every dollar and every tear. I left that town quietly, without a word to anyone. No farewell, no drama, no second look at the house where everything began and ended. I didn't owe explanations anymore. Some people need noise to prove they've won. I only needed distance. I took the early morning bus to a coastal village where no one knew my name, where I could live simply. A bed I bought myself, a cup of tea I brewed alone, and the silence that finally felt like peace instead of punishment. The air smelled of salt and freedom. Every wave that touched the shore sounded like closure. I wasn't running from my son. I was returning to myself. I rented a small room near the sea, white walls and wooden floors. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. I spent mornings watching fishermen mend their nets, their hands rough but honest. I liked that kind of work. Work that left marks on your palms instead of on your conscience. Sometimes I'd walk down to the pier with a thermos of tea, watching the water shift in shades of blue. I didn't think about revenge anymore. I didn't think about the money, or even about Arav's new shop that now thrived under his care. I just thought about peace, the kind I used to dream about in that stolen bed. People in the village called me uncle, not sir, not father. I liked that. There was no history attached to it, no disappointment. They didn't know that somewhere, far away, a man carried my last name like a wound. They didn't know that the same hands that once built a house and raised a son had also written his ruin. And I didn't tell them. Because this was not a story of revenge anymore. It was a story of survival. A story of an old man learning that letting go can sometimes be the loudest form of justice. Some evenings, I'd receive letters from Arav. He never called me father, but the way he wrote those words, the care between the lines, I could feel the respect my real son never had. He'd tell me about his new employees, about how he was saving to buy a house, about how he named one of his garage bays for Uncle. I would fold those letters carefully and keep them in a wooden box, right next to my old fountain pen. the one that had signed both a will and a declaration of freedom. Sometimes I'd take those letters out at night, read them by the window, and smile faintly to myself. Once in a while, my mind wandered to the man I left behind, my son. I heard through whispers that he had moved into a rented apartment, smaller than the room I once gave him as a child. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who once gave away my bed now struggled to find one for himself. He still blamed others, I'm sure. Maybe he cursed my name. Maybe he told people lies about how he was tricked. But lies don't outlive truth. Deep down, he knew what happened wasn't theft. It was a mirror. I had simply returned to him what he gave me. Nothing. And yet, even with all that said, I can't pretend victory feels warm. Revenge never fills the space love leaves behind. But peace fills it differently. I found that peace by accepting what could not be fixed. I stopped asking why, stopped wishing for the past to make sense. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for an apology that will never come. I decided to live mine, proving I no longer needed one. I often sit by the water now, watching the sunset turn the sky gold. I think about the line between love and respect, how thin it is, how easily crossed. My story isn't one of hatred. It's one of balance. My son gave my bed to his father-in-law, the very place that carried my rest, my history, my pride. So I gave his fortune to a boy who carried my heart instead. One act of cruelty was met with one act of clarity, and when I finally walked away, I didn't leave with anger. I left with peace. Final thought. He gave my bed to his father-in-law. I gave his fortune to a boy who deserved it, and left him homeless to live with what he made.